They weren't just accepting whatever because it fit their narrative and belief system. They rejected gospels that actually had better stories of the resurrection than the ones that they received. What's the difference? Who wrote them? Where did they come from? And how long have we had them? That was the basis of it, not necessarily how good the stories is, as they've been accused of having.
So hi, everyone. I am here today with Dr. Stephen Boyce. We're going to be talking about authorship, particularly of the Gospels, and a conversation that has a number of different areas that it falls into and affects. But you hear a lot about the Gospels being anonymous or formally anonymous or terms like that thrown around. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Can we know who the authors of the Gospels actually are? And what does that mean in terms of our belief as Christians or even people who are just interested in it? So Dr. Boyce, thank you for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Nothing special about me. I'm just a simpleton down here in South Carolina, here on the Southeast United States. I'm 32 years old. I work with an apologetics ministry called Explore Christianity, which is a kind of a sister ministry that bounced off of Explain International, and which is predominantly based out of really the Southeast Asia area and Malaysia, and it's down in Fiji and places like that now. And we kind of rolled out from them to focus predominantly on the US as well as in Europe. So what we do there is we have a group of apologists that are working together with different specialties and different studies and emphasis. And we try to equip the churches more than anything. That's something that John Beasley and myself were really passionate about. Is apologetics is good, but there's not a lot of focus on equipping actual churches and their leaders to engage the issues of today. There's a lot of outspoken stuff or YouTube channels, and that's great. I think we need them, but it's really about equipping the saints. That's really what we believe the apologists should be doing, is equipping the saints with the arguments that are based out of truth and research and careful analysis. So we have guys and girls that are on different levels. Some love the sciences, some are into like Egyptologist kind of stuff. And then my focus is New Testament predominant. Now, I love the Old Testament stuff. I always ask them, please don't put New Testament on my name because I'll never get asked to do anything Old Testament. And I keep losing that vote somehow. But I actually enjoy Old Testament canonical studies as much as I do New Testament. But most of my research is based in New Testament canonicity, as well as textual criticism. Now, that was kind of a second tier emphasis. The primary tier emphasis that I was recruited to do my PhD work in was on the basis of canon and an investigation of the Gnostic Gospels. So I spent most of my doctoral writing in the Gnostic text for each class, and wrote thousands, and I mean thousands of words on like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of Judas, etc. So I really enjoyed that. Actually, it brought to light quite a bit of my view of the Gospels. So I placed a lot of emphasis on the Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels by comparison. I enjoyed translating my own translation of the Gospel of Peter, which is just fragmented. We only have one copy that's really still intact that can deal with that gospel. We have some quotes in other historical places that are just paragraphs or so, but as far as what we have is just that manuscript. And so I did my own translation of it and enjoyed doing that, kind of looking at it that closely. Comparing it to, say, Mark's gospel was a lot of fun for me because you got to see, all right, this is claiming to be Peter. This is supposedly being written for Peter. What are the differences? What do we see different technique? What do we see as a writer and his claim? I think those things were really eye-opening for me. So I really enjoyed doing things like that. My favorite Old Testament study was on the comparisons between the book of Esther in the Greek Septuagint versus the Hebrew version that we have, because as much of it, we actually three versions of Esther, but the two main ones would be Septuagint and the Masoretic text. So I had a lot of fun doing that as well, kind of as a side project during school. But I'm married happily to my wife, Claire, and I have two kids. and they're 9 and 6, going on 7, and they're a handful, but they're very bright, very healthy. Thankful to the Lord for them. It helps to have a supportive wife that's behind what you're doing and puts up with a lot of your busyness. So that's a little bit about me. Most of my study is there. Most of my research and conference speaking is all based particularly on canon more than anything.
That's great. Yeah, I can relate to that, especially the family part. It certainly helps
Oh
that
yeah.
your spouse is behind what you do. You did so much work in, yeah, Gospel of Peter. Yeah, part of
Mhm.
my one of my language exams when I was doing my comps was translating a section of the Gospel of Peter. Lots of fun. It was the resurrection part with
Oh
Jesus
yeah.
coming out of the tomb and the cross following him, and all that sort of stuff.
Speaking
Nobody tells you how the cross gets in the tomb, right? But it's there. So following and walking and talking. So
and talking. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So in terms of that, mentioning something like the Gospel of Peter, you have the Gospel of Peter, which has Peter's name associated with it. But then you
Mhm.
also have, the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So why do we have the traditional authorship names associated with the Gospels? And then maybe even you can comment on why do we have names associated with ones like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary? How did that come about in light of what's going on with the canonical gospels?
Yeah, there's probably two answers to the first question when it comes to the canonical gospels. I would say that most people would say, well, that's because these names were ascribed to them on the earliest witnesses, the earliest manuscripts. Like it'll say the gospel according to John, the gospel according to Matthew. And so some that would seek to actually discredit it say this is a later tradition, putting it onto the name of an apostle, which I actually take issue with because two of them don't have apostles' names on them. And some would say this is an attempt to make forgery, which is actually the issue with the non-canonical gospels is they seek to put credibility to their text by putting credible names on them. So when you're talking about the canonical gospels, I like to think of Luke, for example, of all the guys that you would put, if it truly is a forgery, as some say, which obviously I don't believe it is. If it's truly a forgery, as some say it is, why would you put Luke's name on there? He wasn't anything renowned in. I mean, he's mentioned, but he's no more mentioned than Demas or Linus or somebody like that. In fact, he doesn't have like this big role outside of he was faithful to Paul to the very end and that he remained with him. But as far as like his ability to be this great evangelist who was starting churches all over the world, that wasn't Luke. So why would you stick a random name out of Paul's leadership group onto a gospel to give it credibility? So saying it from that perspective of like, well, they put these names on there for credibility. Yeah, but that doesn't really work for Mark, who kind of gets presented in the scripture as a guy who couldn't handle the pressure and ran off. And that's really all you know about him until the very end. Paul says, bringing to me is profitable. So a guy that's kind of not really credible to Paul's early ministry, why would you give credit to that guy? And then a guy that's known as a beloved physician and that he remained faithful to Paul, why would you put that name? Wouldn't you rather put somebody like Andrew or somebody like James or somebody better that has much credibility that was actually with Jesus? Because you have early witness testimonies from Papias who said Mark was neither with the Lord nor heard him, but learned it from Peter. So he's not an eyewitness. Luke at the very beginning states he was not an eyewitness, but his information came from those who heard him. So why would you slap some names like that on there to give it credibility when one of them's admitting he's not an eyewitness and the other one has never been attested to knowing Jesus personally? So to me, the reasoning that some would say, number one, that the canonical gospels have these names is for credibility's purposes. My issue with that initially is two of them don't help themselves if that's the case. You don't see the Gnostic texts, for example, pasting Luke's name on any of their forgeries. Um, they'll go to some of the women like Mary, but Mary was with Jesus. Of course, she has credibility on the fact that she was there at the resurrection, so to speak, as they see it. She was there with Jesus in his travels ministry. She was healed by Jesus. Quite a bit of expression there for her where she can say much. or even Judas. I mean, despite what the Gnostics' view of Judas is, that he was this poor victim who went through this whole process out of obedience to Jesus to help him escape his body, and he was promised, blessing in the future kingdom. Judas was given a lot of information, and he was given credibility because he also was with Jesus. So when you're talking about the comparison of these two, even the Gnostics knew not to stick names like Mark and Luke on, but they did put other eyewitnesses' names. Why? Because if you want to sell something as legit, and you want to actually persuade the masses of its credibility, you put credible names on the document. And you talked about the Gospel of Peter. Right at the end of the fragment, at the very end of the Gospel of Peter, it says, I, Simon Peter. And if you weren't sure which Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew, and then it kind of cuts off right there at the bottom of the fragment. So he's claiming in the first person multiple times earlier in the text, but plainly states not only his name, but his association to his brother, which kind of leaves you with no other possibility as to who it was. It's Simon Peter, the brother of Andrew. And that tries to place itself into the credibility category right off the get-go. Like, I'm Peter, I'm writing these things, because if you put it in just some random scribe's name, somebody who's not recognized, somebody who doesn't have authority in the churches, you get no credibility, and it would be instantly disregarded. And we know this was already happening. So if these texts are second century, these Gnostic texts that are forged, Luke in the first century has already put out the word that many have taken or undertaken the attempt to write accounts of Jesus. And by the usage of the verbs that he used there, particularly in the aorist, indicate that they tried and failed and couldn't accomplish the task. And by the way, I don't even think that Luke was saying that these were like forgery perspectives. It's just that there were traditions that people had of Jesus, or maybe secondhand information that attempted to put together accounts of Jesus and couldn't accomplish them, and they didn't make it. And so Luke, being a part of that same crowd, third generation, if you would, the ones that were learning from the apostles, not from Jesus, he recognized the importance to validate my work requires me investigating those who did hear him. And so Luke is admitting, I'm a part of those who are attempting, but I'm going to put together a perfect work, in his term. I'm going to put together an accurate one, a more accurate one, on the basis of the fact that I am going to the sources who did hear him, and I'm going to report their story for them. And so Luke recognized the necessity of, if you want a credible account, it can't just be some summary or some secondhand information. It needs to come from the horse's mouth. And I need to go to those that actually heard Jesus. So I think the Gnostics understood the necessity of that, and had seen multiple attempts of failure in publishing stories and folklore of Jesus. And in order to get credibility on their account, they had to include the name of apostles or eyewitnesses to get the credibility that they were looking for. So those are the distinctions right there in those two things. You have the canonical texts. Yes, they have some of the apostles' names like Matthew and John on them. Where did that come from? Some would say it came from the earliest witnesses of the manuscripts. That's number one. But number two, they also come in hand on the basis of the fact that early church fathers and patristic writers have attributed a person of interest to the names on those documents. So a lot of the modern scholarship will actually, and the critical scholarship will actually look at it and say, no, this was only attributed by later tradition of copying manuscripts, because we see the name in second century and third century manuscripts. True. But that's not just the only location you find these things. You find first century and early second century fathers and patristic writers attributing these texts before those manuscripts to the same exact names. And so that's a good thing, because what we don't have is some guy saying, well, this gospel belongs to this guy, and then you have a manuscript describing it to another man. What we actually have is consistency with the names attributed on the manuscript traditions we have, in addition to the patristics and fathers. They are all saying that these were gone and associated to the same individuals. So it's not just the manuscripts have them on there. It's that the manuscripts have them on there, and the earliest attestation have attributed them to the same individuals that the manuscripts actually have. And then within that, the non-canonical are inserting in the first person Thomas is in the first person. Peter is in the first person. Mary is in the first person. Judas is in the first person. You have these names in the first person attributing themselves that I am Thomas, I am Peter, I am Mary, and that they were given special secret knowledge from Jesus on the side, separate from the others and exclusive to themselves. So that makes the distinction right there between the canonical texts.
Well, I think those are the main pertinent points. And in one sense, maybe for the listener, it's useful to outline the fact that sometimes the Gospels are referred to as anonymous, and sometimes simply what that means is that they're formally anonymous. And that
Mhm.
if you remove that title, the Gospel according to, you wouldn't know who the author was necessarily. And I think that's true, and that's not unusual in the ancient world. We get that with a lot of Philo of Alexandria's writings. They're formally anonymous. He never kind of refers to himself within the document in the first person.
Correct.
And I also think there's the point of, if the Gospels were penned anonymously, what would be impacted? Well, there are other books in the biblical Old Testament, First and Second Chronicles, First and Second Kings, that we don't know who the authors were. The book of Hebrews is anonymous. We don't necessarily know who the author was. There's been some guesses over the last 2 millennia, but in that sense, it wouldn't impact necessarily that much. But at the exact same time, like you said, Stephen, we have this kind of unanimous consensus of the quotations of the early church fathers. We have the manuscripts. I did some work in my graduate studies on P75, which is a late second century copy of the Gospels, and Leaf 47 on the recto side, it has got the Gospel according to Luke, and that's very, very early on. And like you said, we never have a copy, an early Greek copy of the Gospel of Matthew, and someone else's name is on it. The text of Matthew, but the name of Mark, or the text of Luke, but the name of Philip. That never happens. Every
Yes.
time we have this title heading, we have either at the beginning of the manuscript or at the very end of the manuscript, the Gospel according to, and the text matches, whatever is in your modern translation of the Bible, whether it's the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke. I think that goes a long way to testify to this kind of early consensus, whether we're talking about the manuscripts or the fathers or what have you. So I think in light of that, my next question is, what are some of the pushbacks that have arisen over the last few centuries regarding traditional authorship? And why do you think, given the fact that there is a plethora of information regarding who the gospel authors were, and likewise, the kind of suspiciousness of some of these apocryphal gospels being so insistent that this is Thomas, this is Peter, this is Philip who's writing these things, and the canonical gospels kind of focusing on Jesus rather than the author as the center point of the authority? Why do you think that scholarship within the last few centuries has made those pushbacks on the traditional authorship as they stand?
I think some of it's twofold. The accusation of the fathers that they would have, because I don't think any of them would dispute the early attestation of who the church is claiming to be. The term that I continually hear, whether in debate or in interview or panel discussions, is Christian bias. So to me, that takes a grand conspiracy. And what I find ironic about some of that form of scholarship is they are totally against anything that sounds conspiratorial. And not long ago, I actually debated Richard Carrier on the subject of the historicity of Jesus, but he and I talk on the side from time to time, and actually took a course of his on the side as well. And I remember emailing him back and forth because he's really against this idea. Well, that's Christian conspiracy, or that's bias, or something like that. It's like, so you're anti-conspiracy theorist on anything that sounds conspiratorial, but what we're to believe is that the church fathers, apart from modern technology like we're doing right now, you're totally in one part of the world, I'm totally in another part of the world, and we're having a conversation at the same time. We message each other on Facebook Messenger to originate this thing. Apart from cell phones, internet, Wi-Fi, etc., these groups in an ancient first, second century world, places in Alexandria, places in North Africa, places in Syria, places in Jerusalem, places in Rome, places in the East, all came up at the same time with the same story of origin. And I love what the church father Origen in Alexandria, who later went to Caesarea, said. He said that these four gospels were universally accepted under the sun. Like there was no dispute. Unquestionable is the word he actually used. There was no dispute as to where these four gospels came from universally. So what we're saying is that in all these parts of the world at the same time, these churches conspired together for a story of origin, because that's what we got to come up with. There's no other explanation. Either these churches came together at some secret meeting, which nobody has any record of, came together and worked together to make, okay, let's pick these books and let's say this is where they came from. And when people ask us about them, this is our story. And they all line up. They just so happen to line up in every single part of the world at the same timeline, without technology, without email, without Facebook Messenger, without Skype and Zoom. They were able to accomplish this great task of pulling off the same story across the world at the same time. That's massive conspiracy. To me, that is a conspiracy, like to believe that that could actually be pulled off. And I think that's why people push so hard for these books to be chosen at a particular council meeting. I think that's why the rumor has pushed even in the Christian communities. Oh, Nicaea picked our gospels because they need a place where a church group that represented multiple facets of the world's churches that were apostolic to come together and make some decisions. They have a point that they can go back and say, see, meetings happen, and this is where we got our Bible. But the funny thing is the rumor is it's in Nicaea. There is no rumor of a previous meeting before that. And it just so happens before Nicaea, these books were already being called canon or scripture or authoritative, or sacred is another word that's used regularly by these church fathers or these ancient documents. So their first argument is it's Christian bias. But what it is, it's you're accusing the churches of Christian conspiracy, not bias, because they're not biased to anything in that manner. They're just telling you how they got the text they got. These are the churches that had received these letters originally. When I had actually sent a response back to Ehrman, maybe a year and a half ago, and it was on the epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians. And one of the things that I mentioned to him in a correspondence was that in Polycarp's epistle, he makes reference to Paul's letter to them originally. So if you have Polycarp is writing anywhere from 110 to 135, he's writing after Paul to the Philippians, which is probably early 60s, maybe late 50s at best. So if Paul's writing the Philippians and he sends this letter to them, and then you go another 60 plus years later, here's Polycarp, who was discipled by John the Apostle himself, writing to the same church 60 plus years later. In that letter, he not only quoted from Philippians, he assumed they still had the letter. And he told them to go back and read the letter. And in doing so, it would increase their faith. That tells me two things. One, Polycarp assumed that the church still had Paul's letter. Now, I'm not saying that they had the initial text. Maybe they did. I mean, papyri could last from 100, 120 years if it's taken care of properly. But as much as they were probably publishing that out to other churches, it's very likely that maybe they had a second edition or third edition at worst of this letter. But either way, even if it's the initial text or a second generation text, he still knew of its existence in the church. They still had it. They still knew who sent them that letter. They still knew what was in that letter. And secondly, what the impact and authority that letter meant. They believed it was such a spiritual letter, including Polycarp, that in reading this letter, spiritual faith is increased in their life. So they believed in a power of that letter, not just that there was one that existed from Paul that was still being utilized in the church and they knew where it came from, but that it also had spiritual ramification when you read it. And Polycarp recognized his letter, though he was a good friend of an apostle, his letter was not the authoritative letter. It was the letter of Paul that they should concede to. Like, go to Paul, what he said. So to me, that's there's no conspiracy. These churches knew where these works came from because they were the recipients. And this idea that they lost track of them goes against the earliest witness of that, like Philippians, where he says, Paul wrote you a letter. You should go back and investigate it, and you should see in them what Paul said, because in doing so, your faith will be increased. Polycarp recognized A, they still had the letter, B, they could still read the letter, and C, it came from Paul, and D, their spiritual faith was dependent upon that letter. So I don't buy into this. Well, some, council got together and decided what was what. No, the churches knew what was what. And that was the importance, by the way, I believe a major importance of having the church knew forgeries were happening. They knew people were forging names of the apostles. They knew people were coming in and claiming to be so. Even the Muratorian fragment, I mentioned this in my show yesterday, mentions Pauline letters that were forged, like the letter to the Laodiceans and the Alexandrians, that the churches would not receive because they could not be traced as sacred going back to Paul himself. They had Paul's name. Well, how did the church know the difference between a Paul's letter with his name that wasn't Paul and a Paul's letter that had his name but was Paul? The difference was they knew where it came from. They knew the origin of it. So that brings you to, there was a chain of custody, as I referred to it, between the churches, the writer, and his recipient. So the churches had to have very important instruction from the writer themselves. And I believe the big character is the carrier of the letter. So there was a accepted, like, okay, Paul's going to write it. We need a credible person who's with Paul, who's bringing the letter. And this is true of the Gospels too, by the way, not to just branch into Pauline epistles. This is true of any of them. If a writer has a message for a group, the writer is going to establish a credible carrier to the audience of interest. So if Mark's writing the Gospel of Peter for Peter in Rome, that would have been the initiation. The churches in Rome are going to receive it first. It needed to come from the writer, his authority, Peter, and somebody would have delivered that the church would have known. So when they're getting a letter, it needed to be traced to an associate of the apostle, whether it was probably Mark himself who delivered it, the association of it. When you look at John's gospel, for example, when you're going back and reading some of the Muratorian fragment on him, it states clearly that there were elders in Ephesus who were actually initiating John. Look, I mean, in plain statement, you're going to die soon and your tradition's going to go with you. Can you please get this in writing? And so it mentions Andrew and some of the other apostles were there, and some of the bishops in Ephesus were really behind this. Like, let's get your story in written form so it can outlast your life. And the elders and the bishops in these church would have been the initial recipients from John publishing this gospel account. And they would have been held in responsibility to distribute that gospel from Ephesus being the headquarters to these other churches. And so we know the origin of it based on chain of custody. You have initiation, you have a writer, you have an authority, you have recipients, you have a messenger. They would have corresponded. That's why some gospels were excluded early on from the churches, not a council, from the churches, because they knew the origin of the letter and they had the credibility of the carrier to the recipient. And if they could not trace the carrier and they could not trace the origin of its location, it was automatically rejected. And that's what Paul was telling them to look for in Galatians 1, not just those types of things, because he even said, I write this with my own hand. And he gives you names of people that were with him. Why do the apostles give you names of people that are with them in their epistles? Why are individuals mentioned either at the beginning or at the end? Because they're part of getting this letter to them. Paul sending a letter to the Colossian church, and Philemon sends Onesimus back with it. Carrier of importance. Carrier is a very essential location of where this came from. And if they could not trace the carrier and the original writer, it was instantly rejected because it should be considered fraud. And so Paul said, if you're getting a different message, it's not us. And then he puts his own signature into his letters to make it authentic, and then sends his team of names so that if they're getting a letter from these names, you know it's from me. because I'm giving you names of the carriers. So if a forgery comes in and puts names in a letter, for example, and those names aren't the ones bringing the letter, you can automatically assume somebody's pulling a fast one. If Paul's saying I'm writing this and he sends you names at the end, and one of those names is the carrier, you know it's from him because that person is coming from Paul. And so I think those are things that are neglected in modern scholarship. They take away the humanity and the distribution of these, and that the churches were actually on high alert, especially when Marcion was doing what he was doing in the 2nd century. The churches were on high alert for any corruption, not just the letter, but the work of the letter. Marcion didn't just create new works, he mutilated already established works. So the churches were looking at not just the recipient line and the carrier line and the writer line, but is this what we initially received from these accounts? And if they look different, somebody's tampering with the text. We see people on high alert of that. Even Jerome had this problem. He was writing commentary on the Psalms. Somebody on the other side of Europe was already mutilating his commentaries of the Psalms, and he didn't even have well-distributed works at that point. And somebody in Rome had come to Jerome and said, "Hey, somebody's butchering your stuff." He wrote an entire apologetic against the guy. They knew who it was that was mutilating it and distorting his commentaries, and it was in the same lifetime. So we need to lose this mentality that, well, these people are so disconnected, they just believed anything and accepted anything. No, they rejected a lot because of the very chain of custody that I had just mentioned.
And I think that's a really good way of putting it, where sometimes I wonder when people talk about, whether it's the Council of Nicaea theory or what have you, how they think these sorts of things popped into existence. That the Christians were just so naive that they were waiting for any letter to pop up with a disciple associated with it, and then that's what they would accept. It completely divorces the history and the context of the early Christian community and the intrinsic nature of what was going on. Like you said, you mentioned Marcion, early individual within the early church movement who disassociated the Old Testament, particularly the Old Testament God, from Jesus. And like you said, he went in and he kind of mutilated what we know as the New Testament documents in order to kind of divorce that situation of Jesus and the God of the Old Testament. Some even argue, and I'm confident you're well aware of this, regards to your work on canonicity, that it was due to Marcion that the New Testament canon came into existence. And I think that is also relatively narrow. It assumes that the Christians weren't already on the level of associating the Gospels with the apostolic witness and the message of Jesus Christ that was given to them. Why don't you just, because you mentioned the Muratorian fragment, and talk about the Muratorian canon a little bit more and how that plays into this conversation, because I think that's an important document which sometimes gets overlooked.
So I think it's important to note that the Muratorian fragment is actually consistent on the Marcion. It mentions Marcion, particularly for the purpose of Paul's epistles, dealing with the corruption. Tertullian was consistent with this too. So you have Tertullian writing against Marcion. You have Irenaeus over in the East writing against Marcion. We don't know who wrote the Muratorian fragment. It's likely to be 170 to 200. It's writing against Marcion. Origen mentions the problems that come in. So how is it that the churches were so high alert about one guy? One guy in Rome starts creating these problems in the text. And he's not just getting called out in one location. He's getting called out everywhere. Like there's entire surviving texts that we have from Irenaeus, from Tertullian, who dedicated works against Marcion. How did that happen? You got Tertullian in North Africa. Now, of course, Tertullian's origin and his family from Rome. And then you have Hippolytus, later in Rome, who apparently had received the initiation of how Marcion was excommunicated out of the churches there, where he was a leader later. These guys knew what Marcion was doing. So when you're talking about the Muratorian fragment, it's telling you a history and actually gives you vivid details. When I look at the Muratorian fragment, I don't consider it an independent, I do consider it an independent source, but it cannot be held alone because we don't know its tracing and its origin, but we know it's early. But when you read it, you find consistency with other claims. And to me, when I'm trying to corroborate something, when I'm looking at an ancient attestation or a statement of interest or a statement of a problem or origin, if all we had was the Buratorian fragment, I think we would be in a bad place. But one of the things I appreciate about it is that it is consistent with what Irenaeus says. It is consistent to what Tertullian says. It's consistent to what Clement of Alexandria says. It's consistent to Origen. It's consistent to these other writers. But the Muratorian fragment does have a canonical list. It is not identical with our canonical list in every way. There are some differences. But one of the things that needs to be noted is that the Gospels are never excluded from any combination. Irenaeus talks about the four Gospels, that there was four and no more, no less. And he gives this explanation, like the four corners of the earth. There had to be four Gospels. And he gives all these reasonings. He even uses some of Ezekiel's imagery to tell you why there had to be four. I don't know if that's the best explanation of accuracy, but Irenaeus apparently thought this out. But when you look at the early attestation, there was never three Gospels. There was never a dispute about the names on them. There was always four, always the four that we have. There was never a debate about the Gospels until the 18th, 19th, mostly 19th and 20th century. No dispute. Now, kind of going back to one of your earlier questions, you asked about like, well, why has things changed? And what will be stated is that there's this consensus, which we talked about. And the consensus is that and again, the consensus that hasn't been done or voted on yet, but they have this view that the Gospels are like evolutionary. So there's the Markan priority, which I actually, depending on how we describe it, Greek Gospels, I actually still hold the fact that Mark was first. I do believe there was a Hebrew Matthew circulating before Mark, but I think the Greek Mark preceded the Greek Matthew. And I have a whole explanation about that. I've done multiple videos on Matthean issues between the Greek and the Hebrew Matthews that are talked about in history. But I do believe Mark is first. And so what ended up happening in scholarship mostly is that there's this Q hypothesis. And so there has to be an explanation for the evolution of Matthew, the evolution of Mark, which led to the evolution of the final product. So their hypothesis is this: Mark is first, probably 70 AD, and the Gospels start growing because the size of the Gospels expand, and then the theology expands by the time you get to John. So modern scholarship, for the most part, thanks to Germany, has adduced the fact that, well, the four Gospels were a product of Christian folklore and Christian tradition that started making Jesus out to be more than he ever really was. I mean, this is where you find Ehrman, this is where you find Goodacre, the Carrier, Price. This is their view of how the gospel came into existence. You have Mark, which is probably the most accurate version of Christian communities, although they can't tell you which community. They don't know which scribe. They don't know which location. They can't tell you anything. They just know it's not the apostles. We don't know anything about these gospels. We don't know who published them. We don't know which Christian community. We don't know which bishop. We don't know under whose guide. We just know it wasn't eyewitness based. So these Christian communities come up with this gospel. That's Mark. The other Christian communities, again, we don't know who, we don't know where, we don't know why, and we don't know how, came together and started actually expanding the ministry of Jesus. And lo and behold, here comes Matthew. And then there's other stories. It's like, well, Jesus was this compassionate person, and he told a lot of stories and parables. So then here comes Luke. And then it's like, well, we got to deify this guy. So then there comes John. He becomes a god by the end of this. And so that's kind of the expansion version that most would hold to today, that the Gospels expanded and grew, and their folklore and all their mysticism by the time John shows up has now brought Jesus to be God at the end of the day. He was not only a great teacher, he was a great healer. He was not only a great healer, he was God. He was a deity and incarnate. And so that's the belief system of today. But the problem with that theory and that hypothesis, again, is nobody has ever stated it to be that way. And again, a lot of that has come to, well, how do these expand? There has to be a connection between Luke and Matthew and Mark. There has to be this synoptic connection. There's a missing link. And so scholarship can't bring out the missing link. So there has to be this hypothetical cue again. So that's kind of modern scholarship's view, is there's this evolutionary progression in the gospels, starting from about 70 AD after the destruction of the temple, starting with Mark, working itself into these other gospels. By the end of it, Jesus is deified and he's God. So that's modern scholarship's view. They can't trace it. They don't have a person of interest. They don't have a bishop of interest. They don't even have a Christian community of interest. But they somehow have made the argument, and it's considered academic, that an unknown author with an unknown crowd and an unknown church and an unknown bishop and an unknown location created these documents that all the churches gladly accepted without known origin. Just like you said, they just accepted anything that came in. And I mentioned this in on the resurrection. You and I can maybe correspond with each other on the basis of you talked about the resurrection section of the Gospel of Peter that you've done work in. You know, and I know, if there's a story of the resurrection that the Christian communities are trying to embellish, the climactical point of the Gospels is the resurrection. Everything leads to that. Everything hinges on that. All of Christianity is hanging on the resurrection. If the Christian communities are going to pick a story that would fit better to give them the belief system of confidence, they should have chose the Gospel of Peter over any of the four Gospels that we have when it comes to the resurrection narrative. The story of the resurrection of the Gospel of Peter, you have a play-by-play. You have what's going on before, during, and after resurrection. You actually have imagery of Jesus coming out of the tomb, being lifted up by two angels on the shoulders. You have a giant cross coming out, speaking, and a voice from heaven, and all this great, putting his identification on the resurrection. Then you come to our four Gospels. You have people distraught, believing it's over, everything they ever believed in. They didn't believe the reports. And then women who were not given credible status as men were at that time are the first ones to report tomb's empty. They go back, tell the men. Two of them run, which we know to be John and Peter, to the tomb. Peter believes the body's stolen, walks away defeated. They don't believe the women's report that he's risen, because we talked to an angel and he's risen. Nobody's seen what happened. Nobody was there when it happened. All they know is the tomb is empty, and the people that followed Jesus, who he told them, I'm going to rise again on the third day, didn't believe it. And so when Jesus gives a post-resurrection appearance to them, what ends up happening in the story? He rebukes them for their unbelief. He rebukes them for not believing the report. And they finally, after, and some of them, like Thomas, was until I actually touch him, I'm not going to believe what any of you have to say about the matter, because you guys are probably seeing a ghost. I mean, that's his perspective. And then Jesus appears and he gets to touch him, and then he believes. So you have a story, four of them, where the disciples are pathetically unbelieving. They didn't believe Jesus. They didn't believe the women. The first witnesses are women, which is not a good thing in first century credibility. And then all the men that followed Jesus couldn't even believe the report. And there's no play-by-play, like the greatest moment in history when death was conquered. He came out the grave this way, fully majestic and bright and shiny and busting through the tomb. Like, you don't have that. Like, what kind of story is that? Well, it's one where people can't tell you what happened in the play-by-play because they weren't there. They could only tell you what happened when he went in and when it was empty and what they saw. But the Gospel of Peter, it's a play-by-play. It's majestic. If there's a gospel that should have been accepted for the purpose of making Christianity this majestic resurrection-based story, you pick Peter's gospel because there's way more there. You don't pick the one where his followers didn't even believe him. That's not the one you pick. So again, this idea of like, oh, it's conspiratorial or that's just Christian bias. Our gospels are weaker when it comes to the play-by-play of the resurrection than some of these other gospels. So again, they weren't just accepting whatever because it fit their narrative and belief system. They rejected gospels that actually had better stories of the resurrection than the ones that they received. What's the difference? Who wrote them? Where did they come from? And how long have we had them? That was the basis of it, not necessarily how good the stories is, as they've been accused of having.
And I actually even think that the Gospel of Peter was a part of the motivation was it was written as an apologetic work to kind of dispel the idea that the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection were in fact women, which was an embarrassing fact. And so if you
Yeah.
have the Gospel of Peter has all the right people at all the right place at all the right
Yeah.
times, and like you said, it's got the camera rolling on the resurrection. And so you have, Roman officials and uh, Jewish officials, and they're all camping out in front of the tomb, and this is taking place. And so you have people who would have been seen as credible eyewitnesses, who are the individuals who could testify to that fact. And so I think that's a really good point to say, if the resurrection is the linchpin, then why go with something like the Gospel of Mark, which seems unrealistically tame in the grand scheme of things, and then has this kind of ambiguous ending and some question about its longer ending. And I have videos on my channel in regards to the longer ending of Mark and that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But nonetheless, even aside from the textual variant of the longer ending of Mark, if you go with a Matthew or Luke or John, it's still not nearly as epic, as
Yeah.
sensational as the Gospel of Peter. And I think just for the listener, you mentioned those German scholars. There was a guy named Bruno Bauer who, in the 19th century, he was a radical rationalist, and he studied under Hegel, W.F. Hegel, who many of the listeners might recognize from Hegelian dialectic, and that's exactly what he applied. What you said, Stephen, about you have the thesis and then the antithesis and then the synthesis, and he just applied that to the Gospels. You have a Jewish Jesus, you have a divine Jesus, and then you have a synthesis of bringing those two together, and that's how he kind of came up with this dating system of the Gospels. Wasn't based on the history, wasn't based on the manuscripts necessarily, and it was actually the manuscript dating that kind of blew up the Bauer thesis and his Hegelian method. But
Especially on John. Yeah.
yeah,
Especially on
especially on
John.
John. Yeah, because he dated John. I mean, the consensus at the time was John was second century, maybe even
Yeah.
pushing in the middle of the second century. And it didn't take much for, you find P52, you find a couple of other manuscripts, P66, and all of a sudden, 200 years of New Testament consensus is being rewritten and tossed in the flames. And so I think there's a lot there.
So the consensus always is funny to me because the consensus is an ever changing dynamic. The consensus 100 years ago is different from today. The consensus from 200 years ago
Mhm.
is today. The consensus, and this is the thing that bothers me, is the consensus of church history, not just the last 100 years. The consensus of church history is the four gospels were written by exactly whose names were on. And then they go back to the very place that they have been attributed to. If we were to take the first 1800 years of the church and do a consensus from the earliest historians, the earliest textual critics like Origen, if we were to take the earliest consensus of historians, church fathers, patristic writers, and evidence for the manuscripts, the consensus is there was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The majority of scholars from Jerome all the way to Eusebius, Jerome, even into the time of the Middle Ages, everybody had held in church studies and history. It was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is new. So the consensus is a new consensus. It's not a historical consensus. Because if we did a consensus from the time of their conception to today, the majority still stands in the favor of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I don't like consensus because they're always changing. And by the way, I think you've probably seen this too. The consensus of Q is slowly diminishing. A lot of people held to Q 15, 20 years ago that are actually starting to leave that hypothesis, including atheist scholars. So I'm watching. So again, like the consensus doesn't define truth. If the consensus is truth, then the truth is ever changing. And if we do go by the true consensus, we can't just do consensus in the year, our century. We need to look at the consensus of what has been the consensus for many, many years. The consensus was always Matthew, Mark, and John. until these German scholars like Bauer and others came along in the 19th century. So just kind of to put that plug in there, the consensus is ever changing. The consensus is changing in the last 20 years. And if we're going to do a consensus, we need to consult all historians, all data that we have from the beginning to today, not just today.
Well, if you have 10 biblical scholars in a room, you have 12 different opinions. So
Always.
there's always that. And I would actually be more on the end of believing in Q than not. But I hold that with a very loose grip, because I realize, the field of synoptic scholarship has had many different shifts and waves. And so I think, at the end of the day, the Gospels don't come with nice, comfy dates. And so
No.
there's a question. And I think it's totally reasonable to say, there are these hypotheses. Some are more probable than others. And that's okay. Because at the end of the day, like you said, Stephen, we have this chain of custody that takes the Gospels back into the realm of someone who knew Jesus, or someone who knew someone who knew Jesus. And even you mentioned Irenaeus. I coming from the 2nd century. Let me just read that quote from Against Heresies. He says, "It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are, for since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, and the cherubim too were 4-faced." And to the modern reader, that sounds kind of strange, but this kind of numerology of 4 is a sign of completeness. You have 4 corners of the world. You have
Universal.
North, south, east, and west, and that was kind of an analogy of completeness. And so when he's arguing that you can't have any less, you can't have any more, it's because the 4 encapsulates all that can be there. And then you have a contemporary of his, Theophilus of Antioch, who then associates the Spirit of God working in the prophets with the gospel authors who are writing the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so it's pretty clear from the earliest testimony, there's really no debate as to what the gospel biographies of Jesus are. They're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And to be clear, I think you could still hold it an eyewitness position, even holding Q, just so people in your audience. I don't think my thing is, after studying the Matthew's gospel, particularly the Hebrew version that was early published and then the Greek one that came later, I think if we study that closely, again, I have videos and audio podcasts on this. If we understand the early distribution of the Matthew that was put out, that was in Hebrew, I think we can actually. I think what will happen is you'll find that early publication for Matthew is the missing link. It was his eyewitness testimony, but his Greek version was published as a group effort, not an individual effort, and it was put into Greek so it could be distributed outside of one single location. But I think the missing link between the Greek Matthew and the Greek Mark is the Hebrew Matthew. I think so. I think we all recognize there's a connector between them. And I think personally, after my investigation of this, that the Hebrew early transmitted form of Matthew's gospel was that missing link of Q that connects the two things. And it's because Mark would have been Matthew's eyewitness testimony, or I'm sorry, Mark would have been Peter's eyewitness testimony, and Matthew would have naturally used Peter's testimony because, I mean, Peter's a star witness. I mean, he was in the 3 that Matthew wasn't a part of. And so he got to see things from Jesus that Matthew wasn't there for. So I think it was actually a group effort to publish a apostolic gospel from Jerusalem to be distributed from the headquarters. I think Matthew's Greek version was a group effort of multiple apostles that were still in Jerusalem, which is why the Didache at the end of the 1st century quotes the Gospel of Matthew almost 30 times and refers to it twice as the gospel of the Lord. I think it was a gospel. I don't think it was a one-man effort. I think it was a group effort. And it was the most sought after, most quoted, most published, most transmitted of all the 4 gospels very, very early on. And it was also the most received far out, even in places like India. Missionaries come 100 years later and they're like, oh, wow, somebody already came here with the gospel of Matthew. And it was obviously being the one taken out from Jerusalem's missionary trips. And I think it's because the apostles worked together using Matthew's original eyewitness testimony, if you want to, my missing link to Q, they took Matthew and Peter's eyewitness testimony together from their perspective. So apparently Matthew was probably naturally, as a tax collector, he would have been a very detailed person and taking notes of things. I think he actually kept a journal of some sort of Jesus's ministry, and then Peter was preaching his testimony in Rome, and Mark wrote it down for him. And so the apostles wanted to send out a group effort document from the headquarters to the churches. And if Matthew's original publication was in Hebrew or Aramaic, which is what every church father says happened, then that's not going to help the churches in the East. It's not going to help the churches in Rome. That's not going to help the churches in the South because they don't know Hebrew and Aramaic. So if you're going to publish one from the group, you put it in Greek. And so they would have translated that over into Greek as a group using what Matthew did have of Jesus, which probably would have been more of his teachings. Jesus said this, or Jesus taught this, like the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse. These are things that Matthew has that are far more detailed than what, or not even at all. Peter didn't use any of those in Mark's gospel, but Matthew has those things. Very detailed guy. He would have had that, and they would have used that from Matthew's eyewitness testimony, if you want to call it M source. And then you have Peter's star witness testimony that was circulated from Rome. You put those things together, you can have a group effort gospel that the apostles wanted all the churches to have on their behalf. They would have sent that one out, which is why it would have been widely distributed. And the document, the Didache, calls it the gospel of the Lord because the apostles didn't want it to be something that they would have been publishing under their name because they didn't want their names to be the highlight. Is a biography, which takes us back to an earlier question. Why wasn't it called the Gospel of Matthew in the Didache? Why is it called the Gospel of the Lord? Because it's a biography of him. And now, why was Matthew's name attached to it? Because the churches would have understood the origin of the work. It would have been Matthew probably doing the blunt of the work. I mean, he would have been the main guy. It would have been based solely on the foundation of his eyewitness testimony, corroborated with Peter's and the other apostles that were there in Jerusalem, putting their blessing on it out. And so that goes by, well, why didn't they just say their names in the documents? Why would it have been attributed externally? And the church fathers saying, well, this came from Matthew and this one came from John. They knew where they came from. Then why didn't they just stick their stinking names in it, right? That's why didn't they do that? And you mentioned this earlier. That wasn't the standard of any first century or even earlier's way of doing a biography. See, in the epistles, there's no problem. Paul puts his name, Peter puts his name. Why didn't they just flat out do that in their gospels? And that just wasn't a part of the status quo of the time in the first century. I mean, you have Julius Caesar, Polybius, Josephus, Lucian, Xenophon, all of these guys wrote in the third person and referred to themselves in third persons when they're describing themselves an event about something else or somebody else, but they're kind of on the scene in their own story. You see Josephus do this with the wars. Look how he writes history when he's a part of a war story versus not. He does put third person usages in there, but he doesn't actually say, I, Josephus. These things. Like, he doesn't do that because when you're writing a first century biography, you don't make it about you. And even if you're in the story, to prevent the stealing of the highlight of the individual of whom you're writing, you put yourself in there with names like code name, or you give yourself an epithet like Matthew did. Matthew gives himself an epithet in order to include himself. Mark, to make sure you understand the origin of the story and the place of ownership from the material he's sharing, gives you what Richard Bauckham calls an inclusio eyewitness testimony. You begin the narrative with the individual that is giving you the information. So it starts with Peter, it ends with Peter. You get to the end of Mark, it's tell my brothers and tell Peter. So why would Mark include that? Because he's letting you know the origin of this information is coming from, at the very beginning, starts with Peter, ends with Peter. John starts with this anonymous disciple that's with Andrew, who's not named. You find the pattern all the way to the end. Peter gets the highlight, but Peter's not the main guy. He came to Jesus by the testimony of Andrew saying, hey, you should come see this guy. But there was already a disciple before Peter, and it's John. He's anonymous. Then he leaves himself anonymous all the way to the very, very end. And he tells the story of Peter. Jesus tells Peter, what is it to you if I let him live till I return? You follow me. He tells Peter's story, but he doesn't get the last word. The anonymous disciple gets the last word. He says, this is the one who knows this because he's the one that's writing to you. And we know his testimony is true. So you have inclusio eyewitness testimony in all the gospels that way. And then you have epithets like what Matthew gives. And then Luke is giving you hints all through who his writers are. If he mentions their name, like you go to the disciples on the road of Emmaus, you notice he silences one name and gives you the other. Is it because he didn't know the other guy's name? No. He's telling you by his way of writing and giving a shout out credibility to this information to the guy he lists. So he silences one of the disciples on the road of Emmaus, not because he doesn't know who he is, but because the information he received didn't come from that guy. It comes from the one that he lists his name. So he's giving you ideas of his information. He does the same thing in Acts. How did he know about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch? He wasn't there. He wasn't out in the middle of the desert. He wasn't there when Philip heard him reading from Isaiah 53 and interpreting it for him. How did he know that? Well, if you go later in Acts, the we guy, we, us, and our guy that was with Paul spent the night and a few nights in Caesarea with Philip and his 4 daughters. Oh, that's where he would have learned that story. So naturally, he's going to include it there and be able to tell you the details because he tells you who he's investigated. When you look at the Gospels intrinsically and you actually start paying attention to first century biography works, you can see that they're hinting at who they are in their own Gospels. They may use a code name, they may use an epithet, they may use an inclusio eyewitness, or you find it in their on the spot or what's called a direct autopsy. Anytime you see these guys on the scene that use these terms, detail, but when they're not on the scene, it's very general. It's all through John's gospel, very much through when Peter's on the scene. You see transitions where Peter's on the scene. All of a sudden you have detail. When you're talking about another disciple, it's very general. So Mark's able to give a lot more detail when Peter's there, and he's the most frequently talked about apostle. He always has a lot of detail for when Peter's on the scene. When Peter's no longer on the scene, it's very basic. How does that happen unless there's an involvement? These are clues. These are hints, whether you're talking about inclusio eyewitness testimony, direct autopsy, epithets, whatever it is. You see these in the Gospels, and they're consistent with any other ancient literature at that time. It's a biography. They're not going to put their name. In fact, I make the argument that if there are names in the Gospels claiming to be eyewitnesses, we should be extremely concerned because they're not following that time's usage of biography work. If the name is in there, we should be on high alert. The fact that they didn't put their names in there shows the consistency of the time in which they're written, and they use the same clues that you would find in any of these other ancient Greco-Roman texts. So I think that's something to be considered too, going back to an original question you asked, also tying all that in.
And I think that makes a lot of sense in regards to what you're saying at the beginning about the Gospel of Matthew, because what we know about letter writing is that there would have been the equivalent of what we would now maybe see as drafts. You would have a number of versions, and you'd be using a wax writing tablet, and you would have a number of kind of versions before you kind of made a final copy and put that on the papyrus or the vellum or what have you, because this was an expensive process. And we have, a number of, Galen describes this in a lot of detail, and we have some other writers who explain, this is how this early, 1st to 4th century kind of writing process operated in the ancient world. And there's no reason to think that the gospel authors would have been radically different than how that was going about. And certainly with the Gospel of Matthew, it was certainly the most popular in the ancient world in terms of the amount of manuscripts that have survived today. Matthew and John are by and far and away the most popular and the most widely accessible and the most copied, even though, like you mentioned before, there's largely been a consensus over the last few decades of Markan priority, that Mark was the earliest. The early church didn't necessarily see Mark as that, much better, or because it might potentially have been earlier. The Gospel of Matthew is definitely seen as a more expanded, and expanded is probably not the right word, but a better version of the eyewitness testimony of that. In fact, there were some early Christian writers who actually thought that Mark was more of a paraphrase of Matthew.
Papias states that Mark literally he used the word translated, and I think what he interpreted, and I think what he means by that is he translated what Peter had. So Peter's orally telling a story, Mark's actually putting it into a written form. And you can
Mm.
see that. The style of Mark is abrupt. Its transitions are like somebody talking, and they never leave the scene. The transitions of using names and stuff. Some of our translations actually don't even do it anymore, or not using names because it's such a continuation. It's like, so some of our English translations actually just finally put Jesus's name in there because it keeps saying he,
Yeah, they
him,
smooth
he,
it
him,
over.
he, him. Yeah, it's like, wait a minute. Like at some point we got to identify this antecedent somewhere. But
Yeah.
think about it. If it is a sermon, as all the church fathers have asserted that it was Peter's teachings and sermons put to a written text. If Mark's literally taking note of Peter's sermons and it's being preached in a narrative form, you're going to see that kind of thing. Like, and I it seems that Papias is right that there is a transition of a oral tradition put into a written text. But again, it is based on just Peter. That's important because it's Peter. I mean, he was one of the main disciples who was with Jesus. And so Matthew being a group gospel with Peter's testimony and the other apostles, that would have been a much more sought after gospel because Peter's just giving you and yes, Matthew is bigger because it's involving more voices. The same thing is true in John. Like you talked about the Muratorian fragment. I actually have the quote from John's in the Muratorian fragment. Let me pull it up for you. It says the fourth gospel is that of John, one of the disciples. When his fellow disciples and bishops entreated and said, "Fast ye now." So the other apostles that were still alive and the bishops in Ephesus wanted him to put his oral preaching and teaching all these years into a written form. So they decide, how are we going to do this, or should we do this? And so John's instruction is fast with me for the space of 3 days. Let us recount to each other whatever may be revealed to us from praying and fasting. And on the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should narrate all things in his own name as they, plural, called them to mind. And I pointed this out in my program. It is so important that we listen to the Muratorian fragment just said. John's gospel was a group gospel. John was not just telling his story, although he was the main basis of it, but he's also going to write the story of others. And the Muratorian fragment tells us one of those guys by name was Andrew. And isn't it ironic that the first person that is on the scene with John in the story of Jesus is Andrew? You see, John tells the story of the apostles that are not told in the synoptics because most of them are operating off of Peter's eyewitness testimony, starting with Mark. And then Matthew's eyewitness testimony that would have been survived in keeping and in company with Matthew and Peter together, and the other apostles maybe inserting some of their viewpoints and approvals. But there's a lot of apostles that didn't get any footage of their life or their involvement. John tells the stories about Andrew that are not told. They're listed by name, but there's no story about them. You have Nathaniel, who has a story. Judas, not Iscariot, gets a speaking part in John's gospel that is not in the other gospels. You have Thomas, who gets a speaking part, and not just a speaking part, an event that radically changed his life and what took place in the resurrection narrative when he approached and met Jesus. John gets to tell the story of the apostles that the others did not. It's not because they didn't care. It's because they were interested in getting out the message of Jesus in a written form. Peter died much earlier. And there's still stories left to tell. That's the point about what's happening here. And it even says that he knew of the other gospels. It's not that John didn't know. You have others in church history telling us that John knew of the other three gospels and approved of their truth. But he also knew there were things that weren't fully told yet in a written form that those gospels didn't give. It's not like, well, these gospels are terrible. They just didn't do a good job. I guess I'm going to come in and save the day. John didn't even want to write a gospel. He was content with just telling what he knew. It's the bishops and other apostles that recognize, hey, man, you're getting old. When you die, these stories die with you. Let's give one last push. Let's give one last story to finalize the other stories that haven't been told yet. Your story is being told by communication, oral tradition, but you're going to die soon. I mean, you're getting old, man. Like, we need to get this in written form so that the story can continue after you're gone. And so they prayed about it for 3 days and fasted. And apparently the Lord revealed to Andrew, you should do this. Now, a key word is you should narrate this. I don't think John penned his gospel. I think his education level was basic, just like Peter's would have been, which is why Peter's not a writer. I don't think Peter was a writer. He was an orator. And that's why you have Peter, I think, by the way, just hint, hint, I think that's the major difference between 1st, 2nd Peter. If you read 1st Peter, he has an amanuensis, Silvanus, Silas. 2nd Peter mentions no amanuensis, and the Greek is very, very different in 2nd Peter from 1st Peter. And I personally think that Peter, over time, had a basic understanding. He would have been educated to about the time of 12, just as John, who were fishermen, and then they would have gone into the family business. But they still had an education. It would have just been elementary. I think this is why we find not the best grammar in Revelation. I think the book of Revelation particularly was probably written by John himself. And it was, some would say, is bad grammar at times, but it was very, very elementary in its words and its usages. John's gospel is very well put together, basic grammar, but actually the construct of that grammar is high level. And I think that these guys helping in Ephesus was one of the greatest places you could be to publish works. Some of the greatest scribes and amanuensis would never have been lacking in Ephesus. John would have had access, as we see, to these other fellow disciples and bishops who would have been there. In fact, there's some rumor that Papias was one of the scribes that wrote John's gospel for him. And whether that's true or not, we don't know. But that is one of the rumors in the early church, is Papias was one of the penmen. But it's interesting that Andrew said you should narrate it, but he didn't construct it. So John would have been giving the oral tradition, and these professional scribes in Ephesus would have taken basic vocabulary, John being a simple fisherman most of his early life and then being a disciple of Jesus, would have had enough to write, but not enough to construct something this magnificent, like the importance of the number 7 in Jewish writing and laying it out in a constructive way that is considered high education. John wouldn't have had the ability to do that, but you can kind of see it's like, how did such a well-constructed gospel have such a basic vocabulary? Well, if the origin of the words is coming from a basic fisherman guy who grew up a fisherman, is able to tell professional scribes what he wants to do, and they're able to format it with basic teaching and words into a very high educational written form. Now you're talking about how you can reconcile the beauty and majesty of the construct of John's written form with the basic vocab. Now you can reconcile those two things. And what we see in the Muratorian fragment is Andrew says you should narrate it, but notice as he says, as we call them to mind, or as they, these group people, the apostles that were still alive in John's day, Andrew being one of them. And so I think that's a very viable thing, because how many times does John say we? Chapter 1 in his prologue, he says, we are testifying these things. And then at the very end, we know his testimony is true. Why does he keep saying we? Because I don't think John was writing individually. I think he was writing on behalf of an apostolic group. So you have Matthew, which is probably written on an apostolic group, commissioned out of Jerusalem for the church as early distributed. Then you have an apostolic group in Ephesus that's still alive at the end of the 1st century, in my opinion, 80 to 90 AD. They have more to tell to the story, and John is getting older. They construct a group gospel that John narrates, and they send it out. That is why I believe those two gospels are probably the most widely received, and they were also the most distributed, like you talked about, even in the manuscript tradition. It's also, I believe, why even Codex W, which I'm holding in my hand, I have a facsimile of, you have the order of the gospels is Matthew, John, and then Luke and Mark. And even the picture of the art, which is some of the earliest art, you have a picture of John and Matthew together, and on the back, which is hard to see, and then on the other side of it, you have Luke and Luke and Mark, excuse me. Even the construct, you have Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark in this layout. why did they separate it? Well, the name of the apostles. Yeah, but I think it's more than just the name of the apostles. I think it's the fact that they were representative of the apostolic groups that they were writing to. So I think that's why those two are the most widely distributed in the manuscript form, because they were based on apostolic groups, not just individuals. Or in Luke's case, he was writing on behalf of the eyewitnesses for Paul. So it would have been one that Paul would have personally traveled with, whereas Mark would have been one that Peter would have traveled with. So I think we can understand that. And I don't know your thoughts on that, but that's my perspective of the four gospels and their layout.
I think that's well put. And for the listener, Codex W, that'd be Codex Washingtonianus, which
Yes.
comes from the somewhere between the fourth and the fifth century, but is a major manuscript in terms of the major codexes that we have that are witnesses to the traditions of the text forms that come before. So a very important manuscript, even though it's not a second century one necessarily. I've talked about on my channel why early manuscripts aren't necessarily the best manuscripts, although they can be. Some later manuscripts have just as good, if not better, attestation in terms of their textual form. So that's also important to realize, that just because Dr. Boyce holds up a manuscript and you say, well, that's from the fourth century, why does that have any bearing? Well, actually, it's a witness of, in a lot of cases, a much earlier text and forms of the text that just don't exist, because some of the manuscripts that were used for the base of that text are gone. It's 1800 years old. It lost to the sands of time, and so it's preserved in some of the later manuscripts. Yeah, that's very helpful. A lot of information for us to go through. If some of the viewers want to get a hold of more of your material, where can they find you?
And we have our apologetic group has a website, explorechristianity.net. We're also we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. We have a website which has a lot of our videos, our conferences, our upcoming events. It has our blogs. We have a lot of blogs, articles written too. Also, we have a YouTube channel. We're fairly new because we branched out of Explain International not even 6 months ago. So we kind of launched a lot of this stuff. It's new. It's out there. I think on YouTube, we finally, in the last few months, got the YouTube channel running, putting enough stuff on there to grow it. I think we're finally over 1,000 now on our YouTube channel, which is great. So hopefully we'll keep that building as people get to know who we are, being that sister ministry to Explain. So you can find us on YouTube. You can find us on explorechristianity.net. Like I said, and all these other outlets. A lot of my videos are there. I also have a podcast called Facts, Facts. If some people just like to put, the AirPods in and just listen to an audio version while they're working or something, I enjoy doing that too. It's called Facts, Facts. It's an acronym. Fathers, Apocryphal, Canon, Text, and Scripture is what it stands for. You can find that on there. And all the audio of my videos that I do on these subjects are uploaded to that. So you can find me on there as well. So check out my work and always leave feedback, even if you don't agree. I can take it. So that's where you can find most of my work and follow a lot of the research that we're doing. My plan is to go through every canonical book of the Old and New Testament, look at it historically, the historical attestation, and then the intrinsic and internal evidence as well for them. I plan to go through the whole entire scripture. So far, I've done Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. I just did the pastoral epistles yesterday, and we got Torah coming up soon. Esther's coming up soon. Hebrews is coming up soon, and Revelation is coming up soon. I've got a whole list of things. It might take me 5 to 10 years to go through the whole canon, but I plan on doing basic 1-hour segments on historical attestation, internal reliability to that historic attestation for every single book. And again, they might not be done individually. The pastorals were done together. Torah will be done together. I'll probably end up doing, King's Chronicles, things like that. I might do a bunch of that stuff together too. So keep your eyes open for that. More of that'll be coming out. And then the stuff that's already done, I have also on Facts. I've done why is First Enoch canonical, Gospel of Thomas. I've done one on the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, Peter's letter to Philip. I also have some of the Gnostic ones on there. Now, they're not on the Explore Christianity YouTube for the Gnostic Gospel ones yet. Like I said, we just started that YouTube channel. But if you go to Explain International, a lot of my debates are on that one, as well as the ones I did on the Gnostic texts. So I have a lot of those videos if you're looking for the video form on Explain International's YouTube channel. But if you just want the audio, they're there on my Facts channel. So I did a lot of the Gnostic Gospels too.
That's great. And I will leave links for all of those down in the description so that people have easy access to them. Otherwise, thank you for taking the time to talk with us and explain some of those ideas and concepts. Help us have confidence that the authorship that we read in our modern translations of the Bibles are in fact the individuals who are associated with the canonical Gospels. Thanks so much, Dr. Boyce.
Thanks so much.